Hey there, sleepyheads. Tonight's tale is not about knights in shining armour or peasants dancing merrily at harvest festivals. Nope. Tonight we're diving into the muddy, smelly, back-breaking world of the absolute worst jobs you could have in medieval Europe. We're talking about dung collectors, leech gatherers, rat catchers, and the poor souls whose daily tasks smelled so bad they probably couldn't smell anything else ever again. Spoiler alert, it was rough, dirty, and definitely not something you'd find in a fairy tale manuscript. This story is about survival work, about the people who kept villages running in the most thankless, uncomfortable ways imaginable, and what happened when someone had to do the jobs nobody else wanted. Before we start, go ahead and like this video if you enjoy these slow, softly spoken history rambles designed to help you drift off while secretly learning something gross but true. And if you're new here, welcome to the village. Tap subscribe and settle in for weekly stories that are boring on purpose and soothing by design. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? What's the time where you are? Are you wrapped up under blankets, sipping something warm, or just lying in the dark, hoping your mind finally shuts up? Whatever the case, let it be quiet now. Dim the lights. Let the soft hum of night, whether it's crickets, rain, or your old fan, wrap around you. Take a deep breath. And let's go back to a world where being a medieval knight might sound glamorous, but being the guy shoveling his horse's manure was far more likely. This is the story of the worst jobs in medieval times. Let's begin. If you had to pick one job in medieval Europe that truly stank, literally, it was being a gong farmer. The word gong didn't mean a clanging metal disc like you'd find in a monk's refectory or a kung fu movie. In Middle English, gong meant to go. And what do people go when they're in a privy? You've guessed it. Gong farmers were the men who cleaned out the cesspits of towns, castles and monasteries. They were quite simply the night soil collectors, the human shovel brigade for centuries of medieval poop. Gong farmers worked at night, partly because the smell was unbearable in the heat of day, and partly because nobody wanted to watch them. Their job was to climb into cesspits, brick or stone-lined holes beneath latrines that filled up with human waste, and shovel it out into large buckets or carts. They'd haul this pungent cargo through the streets to designated dumping grounds outside the city walls, or to fields where it was used as fertilizer. Imagine trudging through town after midnight with barrels of human waste sloshing around, praying not to trip on a cobblestone. This was the life of the gong farmer. If there were job perks, access to fresh air wasn't one of them. You might wonder, who on earth would volunteer for this? Well, money talks, even when it smells bad. Gong farmers were surprisingly well paid. Records from Tudor England show that they could earn up to 6p a day, which was solid wages compared to many labourers. Sure, the smell clung to their clothes, their skin, and probably their very soul, but they could at least buy bread and ale with their pay. Also, someone had to do it. Medieval towns didn't have modern plumbing. If cesspits weren't emptied, waste overflowed into streets, contaminated wells, and spread disease. Gong farmers were the unglamorous heroes keeping medieval communities from drowning in their own filth. They weren't celebrated, but without them, things would have been far worse. This was no cushy gig. For one thing, cesspits were dangerous. Toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide could build up inside, sometimes knocking workers unconscious or even killing them. There are recorded cases of gong farmers literally suffocating in their own workplace. Then there were the physical risks. Cesspits were deep, ladders could be slippery, and one wrong move meant a worker might take a very unpleasant dive. Injuries were common, and while gong farmers were often given protective clothing of sorts, woolen tunics, heavy boots, the smell didn't care. It seeped into everything, and of course, the social hazard. People avoided them. The stink stuck around, and no amount of medieval soap or rosewater could wash it off completely. Gong farmers were paid well, but rarely invited to dinner parties. If you squint past the horror, there's something darkly funny about the whole enterprise. Picture a group of men, lanterns in hand, marching like a grotesque parade through town at midnight with wagons full of poop, dogs howling, drunks staggering out of taverns, and there go the gong farmers, clanking buckets, muttering curses, and praying the wheels don't get stuck. And let's not forget the name. Gong farmer sounds respectable until you remember what gong means. It's a job title that basically translates to professional poop shoveler. If you're looking for medieval comedy gold, that's it. As easy as it is to laugh, gong farmers were necessary. Without them, cities would have become even filthier breeding grounds for disease. In fact, their work indirectly helped control outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and typhoid. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Today, we flush a toilet and never think twice. In medieval times, waste disposal was manual, messy, and required people willing to face the stink head-on. Gong farmers, with their buckets and shovels, kept the system moving, literally. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as sanitation systems slowly improved, the job of gong farmer faded away. But their contribution shouldn't be forgotten. They were the medieval equivalent of sanitation workers, indispensable, underappreciated, and always working behind the scenes. So, next time you're annoyed about taking the trash out, just be glad you're not climbing into a cesspit with a shovel at midnight. Medieval life had many awful jobs, but few were quite as memorably foul as being a gong farmer. If you're imagining a gong farmer at work, don't think of someone armed with a shiny set of tools from a medieval hardware store. Their kit was simple, functional, and just as grim as the job itself. Buckets were their bread and butter. Big wooden pails bound with iron hoops, sturdy enough to hold gallons of night soil without splitting apart. These buckets weren't carried one at a time either. Farmers would often haul several, balanced on yokes across their shoulders or loaded onto carts, which meant the smell travelled along with them like a parade no one wanted to attend. Alongside the buckets, ropes were essential, not the kind for climbing mountains, but for lowering tools and sometimes lowering men into the depths of cesspits. If you were the unlucky one to get lowered down, you'd better hope your fellow farmers had a good grip, because there were no second chances if the rope slipped. The work also required long iron hooks, useful for snagging compacted matter or pulling up debris that didn't belong down there in the first place. The medieval people had a knack for tossing all sorts of unwanted objects into privies. Broken pottery, old shoes, dead animals. In fact, archaeologists love old cesspits precisely because they're like time capsules of junk. For the gong farmer, however, fishing out someone's ancient chamber pot with a hook at midnight was less about history and more about survival. The routine of a gong farmer was just as grim as their gear. They worked at night, not because they were mysterious nocturnal creatures, but because it was the only time they could do their job without making people gag in the streets. By day, markets and shops filled the town, and no one wanted to dodge wagons full of human waste while buying bread. So the gong farmers became the midnight shift of sanitation. They began their work after sunset, lanterns in hand, clattering through alleys on strict routes that led from one cesspit to another. Town authorities regulated these routes closely because nothing disrupted urban life faster than a gong farmer taking a shortcut and spilling his cargo somewhere inconvenient. Imagine waking up to find a brown puddle in front of your bakery. Once at a cesspit, the team set to work. Some dug inside, some hauled buckets up with ropes, and others carted the load away. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of grim choreography. Each farmer had his role, and together they moved the waste from under privies into carts lined with straw or cloth to soak up leaks. Then came the long haul out of the city along designated paths to dump sites where the muck was tipped into pits or spread on farmland as fertiliser. This last step might sound like the ultimate insult. Imagine realising the food on your table grew out of last year's privy waste, but medieval people accepted it as a natural cycle. If you wanted fertile soil, someone had to provide the ingredients, and the gong farmers delivered. The work was repetitive and exhausting. Night after night, the same pits, the same hauling, the same foul smells clinging to hair and clothes. But routine also kept things safe. Farmers who tried to rush the job risked accidents, and accidents in a cesspit were nothing to laugh at. Falling in could be deadly, not just from drowning in filth, but from the toxic fumes rising out of decomposing waste. Hydrogen sulfide and methane built up invisibly, ready to knock a man out cold if he lingered too long. That's why gong farmers worked in teams. They could haul one another out if something went wrong. Despite the dangers, their routine had its own peculiar order. They started on the edges of town and worked inward, saving the biggest or most notorious cesspits for last. Monasteries were especially challenging, since a large community of monks could fill a pit faster than a village. Inns were bad too, especially those near busy roads where dozens of travellers added their contributions daily. Yet the gong farmers soldiered on, following their routes, emptying pit after pit until dawn began to break. Only then, with the streets beginning to stir, did they retreat. Carts emptied, tools washed as best they could, and bodies weary. So when we look back at medieval gong farmers, it's easy to see only the stink and the filth. But their buckets, ropes, hooks and night shifts tell another story, one of an organised, necessary routine that kept cities functioning. Without them, waste would have piled up until towns became unlivable. With them, medieval life could go on. Markets could open, wells could stay drinkable, and bakers could sell bread without manure outside their doors. Their kit may have been crude, their routine unpleasant, but the gong farmers were the invisible gears in the great smelly machine of medieval sanitation. If the kit and routine of the gong farmer were grim, the risks of the job were worse. These men weren't just shoveling muck, they were gambling with their health every night. Cesspits weren't simply smelly, they were miniature gas chambers waiting to claim the unlucky. As waste broke down, it produced toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. Spend too long down in a pit without proper ventilation, and you could pass out cold, never to wake up again. Chroniclers recorded grim tales of men suffocating mid-shovel, their comrades pulling them up only to discover it was too late. Forget dragons and battlefield glory. This was death by fart fumes, and it was a real occupational hazard. Then there was the risk of falling. Cesspits were deep, slippery, and rarely designed with worker safety in mind. A misstep on a wet ladder rung or a rope slipping from a sweaty hand could send a man plunging into several feet of filth. If he was lucky, he'd be dragged out quickly, with nothing more than a ruined outfit and a memory he'd never live down. If he wasn't, drowning was an all-too-possible fate. Imagine the shame of your family explaining that you didn't die bravely in war or nobly in service to a lord, but in a cesspit with your boots sticking up out of the muck. Not exactly a heroic epitaph. Even without accidents, the job carried slower, subtler risks. Constant exposure to waste meant infections and skin problems. Cuts from sharp debris lurking in the muck could fester badly. The stink clung to hair and paws, and no amount of lye soap could quite get it out. Farmers might have carried the smell of their work with them everywhere, on their clothes, in their beards, probably even in their dreams. That made social life complicated. And here lies the paradox of gong farmers. They were paid unusually well for labourers of their station, but they were also shunned. In Tudor times, for example, records suggest they could earn 6 pence a day, which was generous compared to most unskilled workers. The authorities recognised that if you wanted someone to dive into medieval sewage, you had to make it worth their while. But no amount of pay could buy them respectability. Their neighbours held their noses when they walked by. People might have needed their services, but that didn't mean they wanted them at the dinner table. It's the same social divide you still see with sanitation workers today. Everyone relies on them, but few stop to offer gratitude. In medieval towns, it was even more extreme. Gong farmers were sometimes forbidden from appearing in markets during daytime hours, since their smell was considered bad for business. They worked at night not just because of the smell, but because society wanted them invisible. They were, in effect, the ghosts of sanitation, only emerging in darkness, only noticed if something went wrong. This reputation produced an odd double life. On one hand, they were relatively wealthy compared to other labourers. A gong farmer could afford decent food, ale, and sometimes even property. On the other hand, good luck finding a spouse if you smelled like a cesspit and everyone knew where your wages came from. Their children may have inherited the stigma, even if they didn't inherit the job. It was hard to scrub off a family reputation once the entire town had wrinkled their noses at your name. Still, the very fact that they were well paid meant the job attracted a steady supply of workers. Poverty is a strong motivator, and if you had a family to feed, you might be willing to suffer the stench. It's easy for us to laugh about the smell from a safe distance of centuries, but in a world without social safety nets, gong farming put bread on the table. It was foul, but it was reliable. And in its own way, it was indispensable. So the risks were real, the pay was good, and the reputation was terrible. That's the legacy of the gong farmer, despised but necessary, tolerated but avoided, an uncomfortable reminder that civilization has always depended on people willing to deal with what everyone else would rather flush away. Without them, medieval cities would have collapsed under their own waste. With them, life could carry on, even if nobody wanted to sit too close in church. Leech collectors easily won the award for most likely to lose a pint of blood before breakfast. These poor souls made their living supplying medieval doctors with the slimy, squirmy tools of one of the era's most popular medical treatments, bloodletting. When a physician decided you had too much blood, which frankly was almost always, you needed a leech, and leeches had to come from somewhere. Enter the leech collector. Unlike gong farmers, who at least had shovels and buckets, leech collectors had the worst tool of all, their own bare legs. The most effective way to gather leeches was to wade into stagnant ponds, bogs or marshes with skin exposed. The leeches would do what leeches do best, latch on, suck until they were plump, and then be peeled off and dropped into jars. The process was efficient. If you didn't mind walking out the water looking like you just lost a fight with a pack of tiny vampires. The risks were obvious. Leeches don't politely sip and let go. They hang on until they're swollen, and while they were supposed to have healing properties when applied in moderation, having dozens to your legs was a whole different story. Collectors often lost significant amounts of blood, leaving them dizzy, weak, or even anemic over time. Imagine explaining to your family that you couldn't work because you'd bled yourself out while trying to stock the town doctor's jar. It's a level of workplace hazard that makes modern jobs look tame. Then there were the infections. Marshes and swamps weren't exactly sterile environments. Cuts from removing leeches could fester, and the water itself was often crawling with bacteria. Leech collectors might end up with sores, fevers, or worse. And since medieval medicine was, ironically, heavily reliant on leeches to cure things, the solution to an infection might just be more leeches. Talk about a vicious cycle. Still, the demand for leeches was steady. Physicians used them for everything from headaches to fevers to nosebleeds. Some even claimed leeches could balance a patient's humours, which was basically the medieval way of saying they fixed everything. So doctors paid well for a steady supply, and collectors, desperate for income, trudged into the muck day after day to keep the jars full. The job had its comic side too, if you weren't the one doing it. Picture a gaggle of collectors rolling up their trousers, wading into brown water, swatting at mosquitoes and swearing as leeches wriggled into awkward places. One slip in the mud, and you might go face first into the swamp. Worse yet, leeches didn't limit themselves to legs. There are accounts of collectors emerging from the water with leeches attached to more personal areas, which must have been both excruciating and deeply embarrassing. As for their reputation, leech collectors probably didn't rank quite as low as gong farmers, but they weren't admired either. They worked with blood, slime and swamp muck, and that wasn't exactly appealing. Still, they provided something people genuinely believed in: medical supplies. In a strange way, they were essential to medieval healthcare, though modern medicine would probably classify their trade as wildly counterproductive. Collectors were often women, especially in rural areas, because doctors could pay them less. They'd gather leeches and sell them at markets, jars lined up alongside vegetables and herbs. Fresh leeches! Get your fresh leeches! Is not exactly the kind of sales pitch that makes people flock to your stall, but in a world where doctors swore by them, there was always a buyer. So if you're ranking medieval jobs on the misery scale, leech collector sits right there with gong farmer. You didn't smell as bad, but you risked bleeding yourself half to death and catching swamp fevers. You weren't shunned quite as harshly, but nobody exactly rushed to hug you either. And at the end of the day, your product was jars of slimy worms that lived to suck blood. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a living. Next time you complain about a bad day at work, Just be glad it doesn't involve stripping to your knees in a swamp while your paycheck latches on and drains you dry. If leech collectors had to bleed for their paycheck, tanners had to stink for theirs. And when I say stink, I mean clear the street 2 blocks away level of odour. Leather was one of the most useful materials in medieval life, needed for shoes, belts, armour, saddles, and more. But producing it required one of the most revolting cocktail mixes ever invented. Welcome to the world of stink engines. Vats filled with urine, piles of dog dung, pigeon droppings, and a constant runoff of foul liquid sloshing through the tannery yard. The tanning process was straightforward in theory, but horrifying in practice. First, raw animal hides were delivered, often still bloody, hairy, and crawling with fleas. The hides had to be soaked in vats of stale human urine to loosen the hair. This wasn't fancy organic urine either. It was collected from chamber pots around town. People literally sold their pee to the local tanner, which meant you could supplement your income by donating. Once the hides were sufficiently marinated, workers scraped off the hair and fat, then rubbed them with a paste of animal brains, or for extra fun, with fermented dog dung and pigeon droppings. This broke down the fibres and made the leather flexible. It also guaranteed that every square inch of a tannery reeked like the world's worst barnyard explosion. The smell clung to everything. Tanners themselves carried the stench in their clothes, their hair, probably even their teeth. Medieval towns often pushed tanneries to the outskirts because no one wanted to live downwind of a dog, dung and pee factory. There are records of entire neighbourhoods protesting if a tannery was built too close, and you can't really blame them. Imagine trying to enjoy your bread and ale with a nice breeze of urine-soaked hides wafting past. As jobs go, it was physically gruelling too. Workers had to wade into these vats to stir hides around, often ankle-deep in urine and worse. The runoff flowed constantly through the tannery yard, creating streams of sludge that stained boots and poisoned the soil. The chemicals irritated skin and eyes, and anyone unlucky enough to get a cut on the job risked nasty infections. Long hours bent over hides also meant aching backs and raw hands. By the end of a shift, you'd be exhausted, sore, and smell like you'd rolled around in a menagerie's toilet. And yet tanners were necessary. Everyone needed leather. Peasants needed shoes, knights needed armour, monks needed book bindings. Without tanners, the whole supply chain of medieval life collapsed, which meant society needed them, but didn't really want to see them or smell them. Like gong farmers, they were paid reasonably well compared to other labourers, but they were socially avoided. If you were a tanner, don't expect invitations to feast at the manor. You were more likely to find people crossing the street to avoid you. Marriage prospects? Slim. Even money can't buy romance when you smell like bird poop for life. It's almost comical to imagine a medieval street scene. A tanner walking through town, everyone wrinkling their noses, tavern keepers shouting, "Wash first!" Meanwhile, the man is carrying coin in his pocket and leather goods that everyone needs but nobody wants to acknowledge came from his rank-smelling yard. The ultimate contradiction, essential and despised. The phrase stink engine wasn't a medieval term, but it sums it up perfectly. These tanneries were industrial smell machines, churning out both leather and misery. They turned animal remains and bodily waste into something useful, but the cost was human dignity. Workers were trapped in a profession that guaranteed they'd never wash the smell away. The only upside, they probably didn't notice the reek after a while. When you spend your life up to your elbows in dung and urine, your nose either shuts down or your sense of humour has to take over. So while it might be easy to laugh at the idea of dog dung being a day's work, remember, these stink engines kept medieval people clothed and shod. Their job was wretched, their reputation rotten, but their output was essential. Without them, half the medieval world would have gone barefoot and bookless. And as awful as the tannery stench was, it was still better than stepping in chamber pot runoff with no shoes at all. As if the stench wasn't enough, tanners also had geography working against them. No medieval town wanted its tanning pit smack in the middle of the market square. The smell, the runoff, and the noise made sure of that. So councils and lords came up with a simple solution: push the stink engines out to the edge of town. Tanning districts were usually banished to the outskirts, often along riverbanks where the constant need for water could be met, and where, conveniently, the waste could disappear downstream. Out of sight, out of mind, at least until the next village downriver complained. Of course, disappear downstream is a polite way of saying we're pouring dog dung and fermented pigeon droppings into the same stream where people fetch drinking water. Medieval authorities weren't stupid. They knew pollution was a problem, but with limited sanitation systems, their best option was to fine tanners if they fouled up the water too much. In some towns, ordinances required tanners to dump waste only in certain spots, or to keep their pits covered, or at least not to let the runoff trickle straight into the public well. Naturally, enforcement was spotty, and fines were often just another business expense. A few coins to the bailiff, and back you went, emptying buckets of urine into the river. The zoning made tanners a breed apart. Living on the outskirts meant being physically separated from other townsfolk, which only deepened their social isolation. Their workshops lined muddy riverbanks, hides strung up on racks like grim laundry flapping in the breeze. Anyone walking past would be hit with the unmistakable smell of curing leather, carried on the wind like an unwanted gift. If the stench didn't turn your stomach, the sight might. Rows of soaking hides, vats of liquid filth, and workers trudging about with boots stained in every shade of brown. Still, tanners learned to make the best of their edge-of-town exile. Being near water made transport easier. Hides could be floated downriver or hauled by cart, and finished leather could be shipped off to markets with minimal fuss. But there was always the risk of annoying the neighbours. Downstream villages sometimes filed complaints about poisoned fish, ruined water supplies, or children coming home from a swim with suspicious rashes. The authorities tried to balance things out. After all, leather was vital, but fines and rules were often written more to appease angry locals than to fix the actual problem. The result was a cycle of blame and bribery. Tanners polluted, villagers complained, officials imposed fines, and tanners paid up and carried on. It's oddly familiar if you think about it, basically medieval environmental regulation. Instead of smokestacks, you had stink vats. Instead of industrial runoff, you had dog dung sluicing into rivers. And instead of corporate lobbying, you had a man with a cart of hides slipping the bailiff a coin to look the other way. Zoning also meant tanners rubbed elbows at undesirable professions. Executioners, knackers and dyers were often shoved into the same fringe districts, creating little clusters of medieval outcasts. Imagine a neighbourhood where one house is boiling animal carcasses, the next is hanging dyed cloth that smells of chemicals, and the next is marinating cow hides in urine. It wasn't exactly real estate gold. Property values weren't on anyone's mind, but if they had been, the tannery quarter would have been at the bottom of the list. And yet, despite being shoved out, fined and avoided, the work never stopped. Medieval towns couldn't function without leather, so they tolerated the stink as long as it stayed on the margins. The fact that tanners were always out on the edge reinforced their reputation as necessary but undesirable. People needed their shoes but didn't want to shake their hands. They wanted strong belts but preferred not to think about where the leather came from. It was the ultimate medieval case of we like the product, not the process. So while the gong farmers battled cesspits in the shadows, the tanners stood out in plain sight, an entire district of stink engines humming away on the edges of town. Their rivers ran foul, their neighbours complained, and their fines piled up. But the hides kept coming, the vats kept bubbling, and the smell, like the work, never really went away. Fullers, also called walkers, ran the equally odorous chemistry labs of the cloth trade. Their job sounds innocent at first, cleaning and thickening freshly woven wool so it could be turned into proper cloth for tunics, cloaks and hose. But don't imagine delicate laundry work with lavender water and soap flakes. The medieval recipe for scouring wool relied on one star ingredient, stale human urine. Forget bleach, forget detergent. If you wanted your new woolen tunic to be soft, dense and wearable, you first had to soak it in week-old pee. Welcome to filthy chemistry, medieval style. Why urine? It turns out that stale pee is full of ammonia, which is excellent at breaking down grease. Freshly shorn wool is coated with lanolin, a sticky wax that keeps sheep dry in the rain but makes fabric greasy and unusable. Fullers had to strip this wax before the cloth could be dyed, pressed or sewn. And since industrial degreasers weren't available, vats of fermenting urine became the cleaner of choice. Towns even had public piss pots placed on street corners so locals could make donations to the trade. Imagine wandering past a bucket in the market square with a sign that basically said, "Please pee here for the textile industry." Romantic it was not. Once the wool was soaked, it wasn't simply left to stew. Fullers had to stomp on it, literally. That's why they were called walkers. They climbed into great troughs of soaking cloth and urine and began marching in place knees high, churning the fabric underfoot. Picture a medieval Zumba class, except the music is the slosh of liquid waste and the workout ends with you smelling like a chamber pot. This stamping compacted the fibres, washed out the grease, and left the cloth tighter and stronger. It also left the fuller with pruned feet, aching legs, and a permanent odour that no amount of rinsing in the river could quite erase. The smell of a fulling mill rivaled that of a tannery. Neighbours hated them, and town authorities often relegated them to the outskirts near streams where runoff could be carried away, and downstream villages could grumble about their fish dying mysteriously. Fines for fouling rivers were common, but just like the tanners, the fullers shrugged, paid, and carried on. Clean cloth was a must-have commodity, and nobody was going to give up wearing wool simply because it took a chemical bath in pee to get it ready. The risks of the job were less deadly than climbing into cesspits or mucking out tannery vats, but still unpleasant. Constant exposure to ammonia burned skin and eyes. Spending hours standing in liquid waste softened the feet and caused sores. The air in a fulling house was thick with vapours, and anyone passing by could smell it from a distance. If you've ever wondered why medieval towns had such colourful scents in the air, just imagine a summer's breeze carrying tannery dung, gong farmers' carts, and a fulling vat fermenting nicely in the sun. Bon appétit. Despite all this, the fuller's work was indispensable. No wool meant no clothing, and no fulling meant useless, greasy fabric. Medieval England especially depended on the wool trade, which made fullers part of a massive economy. They might have been smelly and shunned, but they were also crucial cogs in the machine. Without them, Europe's great trade fairs would have been missing their finest cloth, and noble lords would have gone without their luxurious dyed garments. The irony was that the crisp, colourful gowns seen at court owed their beginnings to a poor fuller trudging through a trough of old urine in some backwater mill. So, just like gong farmers and tanners, fullers lived in that peculiar medieval category of necessary but disgusting. Everyone needed them, no one respected them, and everyone held their noses when they walked past. They were the hidden chemists of the Middle Ages, armed with nothing more than their legs, a vat of waste, and the stubborn belief that stomping on soggy wool was a fine way to make a living. It was dirty, it was smelly, but it worked. And in medieval Europe, that was often the best you could hope for. Of course, no medieval industry stays stuck forever with human feet as the only power source. By the later Middle Ages, some clever soul realised that if you could use a water wheel to grind grain, you could just as easily use one to pound soggy cloth. Thus, the fulling mill was born, a building where instead of exhausted men stomping in tubs of urine, enormous wooden hammers did the thumping for them. In theory, this was progress. In practice, it was less goodbye to the stink and more let's add deafening noise to the list of complaints. Foot-treading tubs were simple: a trough, a batch of cloth, and a crew of workers marching in place until the lanolin was gone. It was back-breaking, knee-wobbling labour, but at least you could joke with your co-workers over the sloshing, maybe even invent songs to keep time. Fulling mills replaced that rhythm with the relentless clatter of hammers powered by water wheels. The pounding never stopped while the mill was running, and locals compared it to living beside a drum line that had lost the beat but kept the volume. For the workers, the change was a mixed bag. On one hand, it meant less time standing in tubs of fermented urine, which was probably an improvement for their feet and their long-term dignity. On the other hand, mills required workers to load, unload, and manage the cloth as the hammers slammed away, and if you were careless, you could end up with more than wool flattened. Fingers and hands were at constant risk. A slip at the wrong moment could turn cloth processing into minor amputation. Medieval safety standards being what they were, accidents weren't exactly rare. Towns had mixed feelings about these new mills as well. On the plus side, they were efficient, producing more finished cloth and boosting the economy. On the minus side, they were loud, ugly, and still smelled faintly of the chemistry involved. Mills needed water, so they were always built by rivers and streams, which meant that once again the waste poured downstream. If your village was unlucky enough to be located below a fulling mill, your water supply might come with a bonus tang of ammonia. The rivalry between old-fashioned foot fullers and the new mill operations was a real thing. Some workers feared being replaced by machines, while others argued that the hammers still needed humans to supervise, so employment was safe. It was basically the medieval version of a labour dispute. Are our jobs being stolen by water wheels? While it didn't reach the level of pitchfork protests, there were definitely grumbles from those who preferred smelly tubs to the constant racket of mills. The funny thing is, neither system was remotely pleasant. In the tubs, you destroyed your knees and marinated yourself in stench. In the mills, you deafened yourself and risked smashed fingers. Pick your poison, permanent odour or permanent ringing in your ears. Either way, the cloth came out clean and dense, and the fuller came out wishing he'd been born into literally any other trade. Despite the drawbacks, the mills spread rapidly, especially in regions like England and Flanders, where wool was king. Entire valleys became dotted with these hammering factories, their clatter echoing off hillsides. Travellers often noted how noisy they were, comparing them to endless thunder. Local farmers grumbled about the water being diverted, fish dying off, and rivers running foul. Town councils complained about the constant din, and yet nobody shut them down because everyone wanted the cloth. Just like gong farmers and tanners before them, the fullers learned that being disliked didn't matter so long as your work was essential. So whether by muscle or by mill, the job never stopped being dirty, smelly, and socially awkward. If you were a walker, you trudged until your knees gave out. If you worked in a mill, you shouted over hammers and hoped to keep all your fingers. Neither was glamorous, neither earned respect, but both kept medieval Europe clothed. And that, unfortunately, for the noses and ears of everyone involved, was what mattered most. If deafening hammers and smelly tubs weren't enough, fullers also had to contend with the slow torture their workplaces inflicted on their own bodies. This was not a trade where you went home fresh-faced and glowing. The first line of assault came from the very chemistry that made the job possible: ammonia. Stale urine might have been great for stripping grease from wool, but it also had a nasty habit of stripping layers off the poor soul working in it. Fullers' hands were constantly red and raw, skin peeling or blistering from endless contact with caustic liquid. Cuts and scrapes, which were inevitable when handling heavy, rough cloth, stung like fire the moment they touched the vats. If a fuller's clothes weren't soaked through, it was only because he'd managed to keep standing on the rim and not fall in completely. Then came the damp. Whether in tubs or mills, the workshop was permanently wet. Floors were slick with runoff, troughs steamed faintly in colder months, and mist clung to the rafters. Spending 10 or 12 hours a day in that climate left workers with aching joints, coughs that never went away, and a general air of mildew about them. Respiratory complaints were common. The damp chill seeped into lungs as easily as it did into boots. In winter, the cold water numbed feet until they could barely feel them, but quitting wasn't an option. The cloth had to be finished, even if your toes were turning blue. And if the chemistry and damp didn't get you, the dust did. Once the cloth was scoured and pressed, it still needed to be handled, pounded, and brushed. All of this shed tiny fibres that filled the air in a constant cloud. Breathing in wool dust day after day meant fullers hacked and wheezed like lifelong smokers. Modern workers might get safety masks, but medieval fullers got nothing but the advice to toughen up. Their lungs filled with particles until chronic coughing was just part of the soundtrack of the workshop, right alongside the hammering and sloshing. The combination of ammonia fumes and floating dust made for a workplace atmosphere you could practically chew. Visitors often commented on how overwhelming it was. Locals walking past would quicken their pace and hold their noses, but the poor workers had no escape. Some probably lost their sense of smell entirely after a few years, which was either a blessing or a curse, depending on your outlook. And let's not forget the ever-present risk of slipping. Wet floors, heavy cloth, and vats of liquid waste were a recipe for accidents. Falling into a tub of fermenting urine wasn't just humiliating, it was dangerous. Workers sometimes emerged with chemical burns or infections, and more than one unlucky soul may have drowned in what must surely rank as one of history's most undignified deaths. Still, the trade carried on, generation after generation. For many families, fulling was steady work, which counted for more than comfort or health. If you were poor, the choice wasn't between pleasant jobs, it was between hard ones and starving. So the sons of fullers often became fullers themselves, inheriting not just the craft but the cough, the cracked skin, and the eternal smell of ammonia that never quite washed out. And the irony was rich. The beautiful, brightly dyed wool gowns that nobles swanned around in, the fine cloaks worn by wealthy merchants, even the sturdy hose on a prosperous farmer, all of it began life in those damp, dusty, ammonia-stinking workshops. The public might wrinkle their noses at the fullers, but they certainly enjoyed the fruits of their misery. So the next time you imagine the medieval wool trade as an idyllic scene of sheep grazing on green hillsides, remember the other half of the story. For every peaceful flock, there was a workshop full of exhausted workers with burned skin, aching lungs, and damp boots squelching on the floor. That was the hidden cost of cloth in the Middle Ages, not just sheep and shepherds, but the fullers who sacrificed their health so everyone else could strut about in woolens. If the fullers left you with a lung-rattling cough and skin that smelled faintly of cat pee, the next link in the textile chain didn't exactly get more glamorous. Enter the dyers and the woadmen, the people who turned drab, grease-stripped wool into something bright, colourful and market-ready. At first glance, this might sound like the more cheerful part of the cloth industry. Pots of vibrant colours, rainbow bolts of fabric hanging to dry, a medieval Pinterest board come to life. But the reality was less cheerful artist and more man who permanently reeks of rotting spinach while standing ankle-deep in blue sludge. The magic of colour came from plants like madder, weld, and especially woad, that stubborn little weed famous for producing a brilliant blue. Unfortunately, you don't get vivid dyes straight from plucking leaves and tossing them in a pot. No, you had to ferment them first, and fermentation in medieval chemistry usually meant one thing: rotting vats. Woad leaves were crushed, moistened, left to ferment, and stirred until they became a stinking, bubbling mess. The smell was legendary. Neighbours described it as a cross between rotten cabbage, barnyard muck, and something a gong farmer might drag home on his boots. Dyers didn't just work with these vats. They lived beside them day after day as the stink soaked into their workshops, their clothes, and very possibly their dreams. The floors of dye houses were stained every shade imaginable, but woad blue dominated everything. Workers' boots tracked it across the yard, leaving smudges on cobblestones and doorways. Splashes left streaks on walls and buckets. Even the workers themselves carried the marks: blue-tinged fingernails, smears on arms, and sometimes entire legs stained as if they'd been wrestling with a smurf. Madder roots produced a strong red, but also added their own earthy odour to the mix, while weld's cheerful yellow was accompanied by a smell that made damp hay sound polite. Together, they turned the average dye house into an olfactory battlefield where your nose had no chance of survival. The process wasn't just smelly, it was physical. Cloth had to be submerged, stirred, and hauled out again, dripping wet, only to be dunked once more until the right shade stuck. This meant hours of heavy lifting, standing in slippery puddles, and breathing in steamy vapours that were equal parts colourful and noxious. Slips and falls were common, especially when floors were coated in a slick mix of dye and runoff. A tumble into the vat could leave you stained for weeks, and while that might make for a funny sight in town, it didn't do much for your skin. Woadmen in particular got the worst of it. Growing, fermenting, and preparing woad cakes for sale was its own mini-industry, and it stank so badly that entire villages revolted against having woad pits nearby. Authorities often forced woadmen to set up shop far from town, right alongside their smelly cousins, the tanners and fullers. One chronicler claimed you could smell a woad vat from half a mile away, which was impressive considering this was the same period when open cesspits were a normal part of town life. To be singled out as exceptionally smelly in a medieval context really meant something, and yet just like the other foul trades, dyers and woodmen were indispensable. Nobles wanted their bright scarlets, their deep blues, their vivid greens. Merchants flaunted their brightly coloured cloaks, and even peasants liked a splash of colour in their Sunday tunics. All of that depended on men willing to stand over rotting vats, stir bubbling muck, and stain themselves blue in the process. They were mocked, avoided, and wrinkled noses followed them through the streets, but they kept medieval fashion alive. Without them, the Middle Ages would have been a far duller and maybe smellier place. So, after the fullers had scoured wool in pea and stomped it into shape, it passed into the hands of the dyers, who dunked it into fermentation swamps disguised as vats. The result might be beautiful, but the road to those rich colours was paved with stink, stains, and more than a few slippery floors. In the medieval economy, glamour never came cheap, and in the case of the dyers, it came with a permanent reek of rotten weeds and a pair of very blue hands. If the stink of dye vats didn't already separate dyers and woadmen from polite society, the very colours they produced certainly did. In the Middle Ages, colour wasn't just decoration, it was status, a literal badge of wealth and rank that everyone could see at a glance. And since those shades were expensive to make, dyers held some of the most carefully guarded trade secrets of the era. Forget knights with swords or monks with illuminated manuscripts. If you wanted real medieval intrigue, you needed to peek inside a dye guild meeting. Those men would protect a recipe for a rich crimson or deep violet as fiercely as if it were a family heirloom. The divide between rich and poor showed most clearly in what people wore. Peasants didn't wander around in bright reds and blues unless they wanted to be accused of theft. Their wardrobes stuck mostly to browns, dull greens and muddy yellows, the kinds of shades you could get from boiling onion skins or oak bark at home without hiring a professional. It wasn't that they didn't like colour, it was that the price tag for brighter hues was way out of reach. Richer households, meanwhile, strutted about in clothing that screamed, "I can afford a dyer with expensive mordants and secret recipes." A merchant's wife in a gown of scarlet or a noble lord in a robe of woad-dyed blue wasn't just being fashionable, they were flaunting their bank account. Mordants were the chemical fixatives that made dye stick to cloth, and they were often more expensive than the dye itself. Alum was the go-to option, imported from as far as the Middle East and priced accordingly. Other recipes called for copper, tin, or even arsenic, which had the double advantage of producing rich shades and slowly poisoning the people who handled it. That meant dyers weren't just stained and smelly, they were also risking long-term health problems in the pursuit of vivid colours. Nothing says dedicated craftsmen quite like inhaling arsenic fumes for the sake of a crimson cloak. Guilds took these processes seriously. Becoming a master dyer required years of apprenticeship, learning how long to ferment woad, how much alum to add, how to layer different plants for unique hues. Recipes were passed down like state secrets, and guilds punished anyone caught sharing them with outsiders. If a rival town suddenly produced a batch of especially rich scarlet, you could bet accusations of espionage and recipe theft would start flying. It was medieval industrial sabotage. But instead of spies stealing gunpowder formulas, they were sneaking peeks at bubbling dye vats. The prestige of colour could also be enforced by law. Sumptuary regulations dictated who could wear what, making sure commoners didn't try to dress above their station. In England, for instance, only the nobility were allowed certain rich fabrics and shades. The message was simple: don't show up at church in a deep crimson gown unless your family tree has a castle attached. For peasants, even if they could scrape together enough coins to buy a bright tunic, the risk of being fined or just mocked kept them in safer, duller shades. And yet, the love of colour was universal. Festivals, holy days, and weddings were excuses for people of all classes to splash out, sometimes literally. Cheaper dyes, though less vibrant, were still used widely, and even a slightly brighter cloak could make a poor man feel like he was strutting. For the wealthy, however, clothing was a chance to show off just how much they could spend on something that looked good and smelled like it came out of a swamp. Nobles might have turned up their noses at the stink of a dyer, but they were more than happy to wrap themselves in the fruits of his foul-smelling labour. So colour equalled status, and status equalled money, poured into dye vats, guarded guild recipes, and imported mordants that poisoned workers but delighted customers. The poor wore the earth tones of onion skins. The rich wore the arsenic-laced brilliance of scarlet and blue. And somewhere on the edge of town, the dyers and woadmen carried on stirring their rotting vats, staining their hands blue and grinning through the smell, because as much as people claimed to despise them, everyone wanted what only they could make. As much as the rich paraded around in their dazzling scarlets and deep blues, the people who actually made those colours paid a price far higher than a few coins or guild fees. Dyers and woadmen carried the work on their own bodies, and not in a fashionable way. The most obvious side effect was the staining. After weeks, months and years of dunking cloth in vats and fishing it out again, their skin became a walking advertisement for the trade. Fingers permanently blue from woad, nails discoloured red from madder, arms streaked yellow from weld, it was less rainbow chic and more permanent tie-dye accident. No matter how much you scrubbed, the colour clung. Soap was no match for fermented dye baths, so dyers often resigned themselves to walking through town with hands that looked like they'd been dipped in paint buckets. Children might giggle at their smurf blue fingers, but it probably made dating more complicated. The staining was the least of their worries, though. Headaches were practically part of the job description. Standing over steaming vats of fermenting plants, ammonia-rich additives, and mordants like alum or copper salts meant breathing in fumes that could make anyone woozy. A full day in a dye house wasn't just tiring. It left you with a pounding skull and a vague sense that you'd just shortened your life expectancy. Some dyers no doubt grew used to it, their bodies building up tolerance, while others probably just dropped where they stood, victims of what we'd now politely call occupational hazards. And then there were the splashes. Cloth was heavy when wet, and hoisting it in and out of vats wasn't a dainty business. Buckets sloshed, ropes slipped, and workers staggered under dripping loads. One wrong move and a splash of caustic brew could land in your face or eyes. Protective gear? Forget it. At best, you had a woolen apron that smelled just as bad as the vats it was meant to shield you from. A splash on bare skin left burns or rashes. A splash in the eyes could blind. For many dyers, long-term eye problems weren't rare. Imagine trying to stir a bubbling cauldron of fermenting woad while half-blind and constantly dizzy. It's a miracle more didn't fall in headfirst. Even without accidents, the constant damp fumes and heavy lifting wore workers down. Backs ached, joints swelled, and lungs filled with enough chemical residue to make later life a miserable wheeze. Yet the dye houses kept on churning, because no one cared about the health of the men at the vats, as the cloth came out bright enough to catch the eye at the market. If you were a noble flaunting your crimson cloak, you weren't thinking about the dyer who spent the last 10 years coughing his lungs out to make it happen. The social side effects were just as grim. Permanently stained hands and the constant stink made dyers instantly recognisable in town. You could spot one from a distance by the smell alone, and once close, the hands gave it away. No matter how well paid or necessary they were, people still wrinkled their noses, just as they did at gong farmers and tanners. There's a cruel irony in the fact that nobles shunned the workers who gave them their fashion. We love your cloth, but please don't touch anything. It must have been infuriating to provide beauty and status while being treated like a walking hazard sign. Still, for all the headaches, burns and blue fingers, dyers carried on. The job had its miseries, but it also brought steady wages, guild protection, and the satisfaction, however faint, of knowing your work clothed half the kingdom. You might not get an invitation to dinner, but your colours turned heads at festivals and parades. In the end, dyers paid in headaches and stained hands so that lords and ladies could look splendid. It was a dirty, dangerous and permanently smelly job, But like so many in the medieval world, it was one that had to be done. Butchers and their helpers were elbow deep in something redder and far more slippery. Meat didn't stroll into the market already trimmed into neat little cuts wrapped in waxed paper. In the Middle Ages, animals arrived alive and kicking, and it was the job of the butcher and his yard hands to transform moo, bar or cluck into tonight's supper. Their daily routine was a messy business of bleeding, flaying and gutting, with every part of the animal accounted for, even the bits you probably wish weren't. The process started with slaughter. Cattle, pigs, sheep and poultry were herded into crowded slaughter yards, where workers had to wrestle, restrain and finally bleed them out. The bleeding itself was both gruesome and vital. A quick cut to the throat with a sharp knife, then buckets catching the blood. Some of it was sold directly, blood pudding didn't make itself, while the rest often ended up in barrels bound for tanners or other trades that had a bizarre knack for turning gore into useful products. In an age with no refrigeration, nothing could be wasted. Once the animal was bled, the flaying began. Butchers peeled off hides and pelts with practiced skill, working quickly before the carcass stiffened. Hides went straight to the tanners, who would cheerfully marinate them in dung and urine until they turned into leather. For the butcher's men, though, it was a slick, exhausting job, knives slipping against flesh while your boots sank into sawdust or straw laid down to soak up the constant flow of blood. If you think cleaning a kitchen counter after chopping meat is annoying, imagine doing it on an industrial scale every day while standing in ankle-deep gore. Next came gutting, which was never a clean affair. The stomach, intestines and other innards had to be opened carefully. Too much pressure and you'd end up sprayed with the day's grass or grain mash. Offal, a polite word for all the slimy bits, was sorted into piles. Some was destined for sausages, pies or animal feed. Some was boiled down for lard or tallow. And some, frankly, was only useful if you had an enemy you wanted to horrify. Butchers didn't get to gag or turn up their noses. Every organ had to be accounted for. Kidneys, liver, hearts, all were valuable. Even heads were cleaned and sold, eyes staring out from the market stall like grotesque decorations. The smell was indescribable. Fresh blood, steaming guts, damp straw, and the sweat of men wrestling with carcasses created a stench that lingered in the yard and clung to anyone who worked there. Washing it off at the end of the day was almost impossible. Butchers often carried the tang of iron and fat on their clothes, meaning you could tell where someone worked long before they introduced themselves. Walking into church after a morning in the slaughter yard must have been a memorable experience for everyone within sniffing distance. For all the gore, butchers had to keep a keen business sense. Every scrap of an animal was worth something, and nothing was thrown away lightly. Fat was rendered into tallow for candles and soap. Bones were boiled for glue. Even hooves had uses, though exactly who first thought of grinding them into gelatin is anyone's guess. The slaughter yard was less a place of waste than a medieval recycling centre, albeit one with a lot more blood and guts. And yet, despite the revolting nature of the work, butchers were vital. Towns relied on them to keep meat flowing into markets, feasts and households. Without them, no roast goose for Christmas, no bacon for breakfast, no stew bubbling in a peasant's pot. Their trade kept communities fed, hides supplied, and half the foul industries of the Middle Ages in business. The next time you picture a knight tucking into a hearty meal, remember that somewhere nearby, a butcher had spent the morning knee-deep in blood to make it happen. Of course, letting a bunch of men hack up cows in the middle of town without rules would have turned every street into a river of gore. Medieval townsfolk might have had strong stomachs compared to us, but even they didn't want to wade through entrails on the way to buy bread, so butchery was tightly regulated. Enter the guilds, city ordinances, and a laundry list of market controls designed to keep the meat trade profitable, somewhat sanitary, and, most importantly, out of the neighbours' shoes. The Butchers' Guild was no joke. They had their own rules, their own weights and measures, and inspectors who would swoop in to make sure no one was cheating customers. Medieval shoppers were wary of shortchanging, and for good reason. If a butcher promised you a pound of pork and delivered 3/4 of a pound padded with fat, you could end up paying feast day prices for scraps. Guild weights were kept under lock and key, and butchers caught shaving ounces could be fined, flogged, or worse, forced to eat their own dodgy sausages, perhaps the cruelest punishment of all. Blood management was another big issue. Slaughter yards bled animals by the dozens, and without a system, the streets would have looked like a battlefield. Regulations required butchers to use designated gutters to carry blood away, usually towards streams outside the walls. In theory, this kept markets clean and stopped towns from smelling like a murder scene. In practice, gutters clogged, overflowed, or accidentally discharged right where people fetched water. You can imagine the complaints. Nothing ruins your appetite for soup faster than finding yesterday's cow blood swirling in the bucket. Dumping rules were strict, at least on paper. Offal, bones, and unusable bits weren't supposed to be tossed into alleys or left for stray dogs. Town ordinances spelled out designated pits or carts for disposal. Fines were levied if you were caught chucking guts behind the tavern or letting pigs snuffle through piles of discarded lungs. Butchers who thought they could get away with it sometimes discovered their neighbours weren't shy about reporting them. After all, no one wanted to live next door to a man who thought a public lane was a good place to dump a goat's head. Markets themselves were controlled environments. Stalls had to be inspected, meat had to be displayed at set hours, and quality had to be guaranteed. Selling old or diseased meat was a serious offence, since spoiled pork didn't just make you sick. It could wipe out a family. Inspectors patrolled like hawks, ready to confiscate anything suspicious. Butchers grumbled, but the rules also protected their trade. Nothing ruins business faster than customers deciding meat is more dangerous than it's worth. And then there was the ever-present issue of space. Butchers needed room to slaughter, flay and gut, but town councils didn't want them smack in the middle of the market. The compromise was designated shambles, special butchers' quarters where all the mess could be contained. The word shambles today means chaos, and that's no accident. Medieval shambles were narrow alleys lined with butcher stalls, the cobbles slick with blood, the air heavy with the smell of fresh carcasses. Authorities required butchers to stick to these zones so the rest of the market could operate without customers slipping in entrails. None of these controls made the work clean, but they kept the chaos just barely manageable. Customers could buy their meat without gagging too much. Towns avoided drowning in blood runoff, and butchers carried on their trade under the watchful eye of the guild. It was a system of compromise. Everyone knew the job was messy, but with rules in place, at least the mess stayed mostly where it belonged. Without these controls, medieval towns would have been less bustling marketplace and more open-air abattoir. With them, the shambles were contained, the guild kept order, and the rest of the city could pretend, just for a moment, that dinner didn't begin with a man swinging a cleaver over a bucket of blood. Even with the guild rules, blood gutters and shambles zoning, the day-to-day realities of a slaughter yard were still nothing short of revolting. Butchers had to live with what could politely be called filth factors, the swarming, squelching, slippery problems that came with their trade no matter how many ordinances were written down on parchment. First on the list, flies. A medieval slaughter yard in summer was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for buzzing insects. Fresh blood, steaming guts, and piles of offal were irresistible. Clouds of flies descended the moment an animal hit the ground, coating hides and carcasses like a living black carpet. Butchers swatted constantly, but there was no winning. It wasn't just unpleasant. Flies carried disease, spreading whatever bacteria they picked up from guts and waste straight to the next slab of meat. Customers had to trust that a quick rinse or a heavy stew pot would kill off the worst of it, but the reality was that everyone was probably eating a side order of fly at some point. Then there was the blood itself, warm, sticky, and absolutely everywhere. Straw was scattered on floors to soak it up, but by midday it was a soggy, crimson sludge that squelched underfoot. Butchers worked in permanent slip hazards, blades flashing as they tried not to topple into the mess. It didn't help that animals didn't always go quietly. An untimely kick from a dying cow or a thrashing pig could send a worker sprawling. Combine that with the constant slick of fat, grease and blood, and you had an accident waiting to happen. Medieval first aid didn't extend much beyond wrap it in a rag and hope, so even minor slips could be dangerous. The smell, too, was legendary. Warm blood has a metallic tang that lingers in the nose, and once it mixed with the odours of intestines, manure and damp straw, the result was unforgettable. Locals living near shambles complained endlessly, but meat had to be sold where customers were, so the smell was just part of shopping life. Housewives picking out cuts of pork had to do so while trying not to gag, a skill that probably deserves its own line in the history of domestic labour. Winter brought its own brand of filth factor. Because feed was expensive and keeping herds alive through the cold months wasn't practical, animals were often slaughtered in bulk just before winter set in. Entire herds of cattle or flocks of sheep were killed over the course of a few days, filling the yards with more carcasses than they could process quickly. The result was chaos, piles of hides, stacks of bones and barrels of blood, all jostling for space with workers trying to keep up. It was a frenzy of butchery that made the usual mess look almost neat. If you thought the smell of one cow was bad, try a week's worth of them rotting slowly in the cold. Of course, every one of these filth factors made the work more miserable for the butchers themselves. Their clothes were permanently stained, their boots squelched no matter how much straw was laid down, and their hands carried the scent of blood long after the day was done. You couldn't scrub away the smell, and even if you tried, the next morning's slaughter would bring it back again. The flies, the slick floors, the reek of warm blood, these were just part of the job description. Yet somehow, business boomed. Customers still flocked to the shambles because everyone needed meat. Butchers grumbled, slipped and swatted at flies, but they kept on swinging cleavers and carving joints. If medieval sanitation was a balancing act, the butchers were walking it daily on a floor made of blood-soaked straw. It wasn't dignified, it wasn't clean, it certainly wasn't pretty, but it was life, and in the Middle Ages, that was more than enough. If you thought butchers had it bad, at least they were working with animals that were freshly slaughtered and technically food. For the knackers and renderers, often called the dead animal men, freshness wasn't usually part of the deal. Their job was carrion duty, collecting carcasses that had already keeled over in fields, on roadsides, or in barns, and making the best of what was left. A cow struck down by disease, a horse that collapsed on the road, or a cart-pulling ox that dropped dead in harness all went straight to the knackers. They weren't dealing in prime cuts. They were dealing in whatever hadn't yet been nibbled by crows or stiffened beyond recognition. Knackers were essentially medieval waste managers for the animal kingdom. When a farmer's beast died suddenly, you didn't just dig a hole and bury it. In crowded towns or villages, that was a recipe for stench and disease. Instead, you called in the knacker who would haul the carcass away, sometimes whole, sometimes chopped into manageable pieces, and strip it for whatever could still be salvaged. Hide? Useful. Fat? Rendered into tallow. Bones? Boiled for glue. Meat? Well, if it looked decent, it might quietly make its way into the cheaper end of the market, though nobody liked to think too hard about where their stew meat had come from. The actual collection process was as grim as you're imagining. Picture a horse lying stiff in the middle of the road, traffic backed up, farmers grumbling. The knacker arrives with a cart, a couple of hooks, and the kind of face that says, "I stopped smelling things 10 years ago." He and his assistants haul the carcass up, maybe slice it into chunks if it's too heavy, and load it onto the wagon. By the time he trundles back out of town, the road is cleared, but the air smells worse, and the locals are muttering about how close they came to gagging into their cloaks. The stripping yards where carcasses were processed were even worse. These were usually set up far outside towns, because the smell of rotting flesh, boiling fat, and piles of bones wasn't something you wanted drifting over the marketplace. Workers skinned the animals, chopped them apart, and tossed the scraps into vats for rendering. Imagine cauldrons bubbling with liquefied fat, bones stacked like firewood, and hides stretched out to dry while crows squabbled overhead. Even compared to the tanners, the knackers' yards were notorious. Stray dogs prowled, rats thrived, and the smell was legendary. If the wind changed, you'd know exactly where you were, even with your eyes closed. And yet, just like every other foul trade, the work mattered. Someone had to keep towns and villages clear of animal corpses. A dead cow left to rot in the road didn't just smell, it attracted vermin and spread disease. Knackers provided a vital, if deeply unpleasant, service, keeping the environment marginally less disgusting than it could have been. They were part of the unglamorous backbone of medieval sanitation, quietly hauling away what no one else wanted to touch. That didn't make them popular. Much like gong farmers and tanners, knackers were despised even as they were needed. Children laughed at them, adults avoided them, and they were often forced to live on the fringes of society. Their yards were tucked well away from respectable neighbourhoods, sometimes near the executioner's house, because apparently medieval zoning had a rule that if you stank, you all had to live together. The irony, of course, was that everyone depended on them. Farmers were relieved when a dead beast disappeared from their fields. Townsfolk were grateful the roads weren't clogged with carcasses. Candle makers, soap makers and glue boilers relied on their supplies, but nobody wanted to shake their hand or invite them to supper. A man who spent his days boiling horse bones and scraping maggots off hides was never going to be the life of the feast. Still, the knackers kept going, carting away carcasses and stripping them down, one dead beast at a time. Their work may have been filthy, stinking and socially humiliating, but it kept the machinery of medieval life turning, quite literally, since tallow from their vats lit candles and greased cart axles. Without them, medieval streets would have been clogged with corpses, the air thick with decay. With them, there was at least a fighting chance you could breathe on your way to market. The next stage of the knacker's job was positively stomach-turning, the boiling. Once the hides were stripped and the bones sorted, everything that remained went into vast kettles that bubbled away like a witch's cauldron, except instead of magical brews, these pots churned with liquefied fat, softened bones, and the unmistakable perfume of death warmed over. This was where tallow, glue, and all manner of useful byproducts were coaxed out of dead beasts. It was recycling at its finest, if by finest you mean most likely to make your neighbours vomit. Tallow was the main prize. Every candle flickering in a medieval home, every torch burning in a tavern, and many of the greased cart axles rolling down roads owed something to the vats of fat bubbling in the knackers' yards. The process was simple in theory. Melt down the fat, skim off the impurities, pour it into moulds. But in practice, it meant days of standing over boiling grease, dodging splashes that could blister skin in an instant. The smell of cooking meat might make your mouth water at a feast, but stretch that aroma across rotting fat heated for hours, and you've crossed into the realm of gag reflex. Workers emerged with hair and clothes steeped in a smell that no amount of river washing could disguise. Glue was another big commodity. Bones were chopped and simmered until they released gelatin, which, once dried, became the sticky substance used by carpenters, bookbinders, and anyone who needed things to hold together. The trouble was that boiling bones didn't exactly produce the sweet smell of a bakery. Instead, it filled the yard with a sour, acrid stench that clung to the lungs. Add to that the endless scraping and skimming required to keep the kettles from boiling over, and you had a job that was both monotonous and miserable. The only upside was that you could tell yourself, I'm not just making soup, I'm making history stick together. Horns and hooves had their uses too. Heated and softened, horn could be pressed into combs, buttons, or even lantern windows. Hooves were boiled down for glue alongside bones, and nothing went to waste if it could be sold. But working with them was a sensory nightmare. Imagine a yard where one vat is burping out fumes of boiling fat, another is belching the smell of cooked marrow, and a third is releasing the delicate bouquet of roasted hoof. Medieval life was full of unpleasant odours, but knackers' yards specialised in combining them all at once into something truly unforgettable. The danger wasn't just the stink. Those vats were enormous, hot and temperamental. One slip with a ladle, one stumble on a greasy floor, and you could end up with burns that made you wish you'd taken up basket weaving instead. Fires were a constant risk too. Rendering fat in wooden sheds with open flames was asking for trouble, and knackers' yards occasionally went up in spectacular blazes. The only thing worse than a knackers' yard at full operation was a knackers' yard on fire. Imagine the smell of burning fat and rotting hides wafting over the countryside. And yet, for all the filth, people lined up for the products. Tallow was essential for light, glue for industry, and horn goods for everyday life. Villages depended on the knackers' bubbling cauldrons, even as they complained about the fumes. It was the same old medieval contradiction: despise the worker, but buy his wares. Children might pinch their noses and laugh when a knacker walked past, but their homes were lit with his candles. Nobles might wrinkle their brows at the smell, but they combed their hair with horn combs that came straight out of his yard. So the knackers boiled and bubbled, skimming fat, softening bones, and breathing in fumes that probably shortened their lives. They weren't glamorous, they weren't loved, but they kept medieval households supplied with the everyday objects that made life possible. And while the guilds of dyers might have guarded their bright colours and the butchers strutted in their shambles, the knackers stirred their kettles on the edge of town, turning death into profit, one revolting cauldron at a time. If the boiling vats weren't enough to make knackers unpopular, the constant brush with disease certainly sealed their reputation. Dead animals didn't always keel over because they were old or clumsy. Often they dropped from illnesses that people barely understood and definitely didn't want spreading. This meant knackers were handling carcasses, crawling with contagion, pawing through swollen bellies and festering sores, while everyone else gave the field a wide berth. In an age when plague could wipe out half a town, anyone who voluntarily dragged corpses into carts was considered both brave and slightly insane. Brave, because the job kept communities clean. Insane, because it seemed like an invitation to catch something fatal. Small wonder towns shoved knackers and renderers well beyond the walls. They lived on the margins, literally. If you wanted to find them, you'd head past the respectable tradesmen, keep walking past the shambles and tanners, and only when you reached the point where the air smelled faintly of boiled hoof and despair would you know you were close. This wasn't just zoning policy. It was survival strategy. Better the wind carry those fumes and germs away from the town than let them mingle with the baker's bread and the brewer's ale. Class played into it too. Knackers weren't guildmen with carefully guarded secrets and badges of honour. They were the lowest rung of useful labourers, lumped in with hangmen and gong farmers as people you needed but didn't want at your table. Children were warned not to play near the knacker's yard. Mothers muttered about the risk of catching something. Even the church treated them with a bit of distance, sometimes burying knackers in separate plots or discouraging them from mixing with the main parish flock. For all practical purposes, they were outsiders in their own communities. That stigma bled into daily life. A knacker walking into town was met with pinched noses and sidelong glances, no matter how many candles or combs his yard supplied. His stained clothes, his unmistakable smell, and the general aura of man who lives knee-deep in plague risk meant social invitations were scarce. Marriages into other trades were rare. Knackers' families tended to stick together, partly from shared experience and partly because no one else wanted to marry into the smell. Of course, the irony was that their work often helped keep disease out of towns. By carting off carcasses and rendering them down, knackers reduced the chance of vermin spreading illness from rotting animals left in streets or fields. But nuance doesn't usually matter when you reek of boiling fat and diseased hide. People saw the danger, not the benefit, and the knacker carried the stigma. And yet, despite the risks, someone always took up the trade. Poverty was the usual reason. If you had no land, no craft, and no connections, a job nobody else wanted might be the only option. It paid something, it kept a roof overhead, and it came with a kind of grim job security. Animals were always going to die, plague or no plague. The knackers might cough more, smell worse, and live shorter lives, but at least they weren't starving. So the knackers remained, perched on the edge of towns like human scarecrows, keeping the landscape clear of corpses while absorbing the social disgust of everyone else. They were essential, they were feared, and they were despised in equal measure. A strange place to occupy in the medieval class system. But then again, when your career path begins with dragging bloated cows off the road, you can't expect to end up in the mayor's chair. If the knackers spent their lives elbow-deep in dead animals, the grave diggers and plague bearers took things one grim step further. They worked with the human version. In an era before cremation was common, and when death came knocking with alarming regularity, somebody had to get the bodies into the ground. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't respected, and it certainly wasn't fragrant. But without grave diggers, medieval towns would have been drowning in corpses. Their work began not in ceremony but in soil, hard, stubborn soil that rarely cooperated. Digging a grave sounds straightforward until you try doing it with medieval tools. A spade, a pick, and a back that hadn't given out yet were your only allies. In summer, the earth baked into clay so tough you might as well have been hacking at pottery. In winter, the ground froze solid, making every grave a battle of man versus permafrost. Waterlogged soil added its own misery. If you managed to carve out a pit, there was every chance it would fill up with groundwater faster than you could dig. Nothing says dignified burial like bailing out a grave with a bucket before you lower in the coffin. The work wasn't optional. Death didn't pause for weather. If the plague was raging, grave diggers had to work faster than ever, shoveling pits at a pace no sane person would attempt under normal conditions. Mass burials became a grim necessity, with trenches dug as quickly as possible and bodies stacked in layers. Soil was heaped over the top, sometimes so thinly that dogs and rats managed to dig their way in later. Gravediggers weren't just digging holes, they were fighting a constant race against rot and the neighbours' sense of smell. In quieter times, the job was still relentless. Ordinary parish burials required neat individual plots, which meant careful spacing in overcrowded churchyards. Medieval cemeteries were not endless green lawns. They were small, walled spaces crammed with centuries of bodies. Digging a new grave often meant uncovering old bones, which had to be gathered and stacked in ossuaries. Imagine digging diligently only to hear your shovel crunch against someone who'd been planted 50 years earlier. Grave diggers treated it as routine, sweep the bones to the side, carry on digging, but it must have made for awkward conversations with mourners watching nearby. Physical strain was another constant. Shifts went on until the job was done, and there was no easy way to pace yourself. Graves had to be deep enough to prevent animals from digging, wide enough to fit a coffin, and fast enough to keep up with demand. Backs cracked, hands blistered, and exhaustion set in long before the last spade of soil hit the mound. Unlike other trades, there was no sense of completion or artistry. Nobody applauded a well-dug hole. The best you could hope for was that nobody complained about its depth. And while grave diggers weren't quite as reviled as knackers or gong farmers, their work carried its own stigma. They were daily reminders of mortality, walking around with dirt under their nails and the faint whiff of recently disturbed earth clinging to their clothes. People relied on them, thanked them at funerals, and then tried not to sit too close in church. It was a job that inspired more pity than admiration, a trade necessary for the dignity of the dead, but never celebrated by the living. So, while others built houses, baked bread, or spun cloth, grave diggers hammered at frozen clay, hauled water out of soggy holes, and stacked bones in corners no one wanted to think about. Their contribution to medieval life was grim but essential, keeping the dead beneath the ground and the living from tripping over them. Without them, towns would have been unlivable. With them, death was at least given a place, even if the work that made it possible broke backs, froze fingers, and left grave diggers with more experience of stubborn soil than any farmer ever dreamed of. Plague years turned the grave digger's job into something closer to a war effort. Ordinary routines, digging neat plots, lowering coffins, saying a few words, went out the window when half the neighbourhood keeled over in the same week. Suddenly, crisis mode took over, and gravediggers found themselves running one of the most chaotic operations of the Middle Ages, the plague pit. When death arrived in waves, there simply wasn't time for custom work. Graves weren't measured carefully, they were hacked out in trenches. Lime was sprinkled liberally over bodies to tamp down the stench and, in theory, slow the spread of contagion. Coffins were a luxury, so most of the dead were wrapped in shrouds, often just a sheet, or sometimes nothing more than whatever cloth the family could spare. Shrouds meant speed: roll, tie, haul, dump. It was grim, efficient, and utterly dehumanizing, but efficiency was the only way to keep up with the carts arriving daily, piled high with corpses. The sight of these mass burials became one of the defining images of the Black Death. Grave diggers couldn't keep up with the pace of death, and towns turned into conveyor belts of morbidity. Cart drivers collected bodies from houses where entire families had been wiped out, rolled them through the streets, and dumped them in pits where diggers scrambled to cover them before the smell grew unbearable. Hurry became the only right most victims received. A priest might wave a hand or mutter a prayer over the pit, but the usual funeral customs, processions, hymns, candles, were abandoned. Too many bodies, not enough time. Lime sprinkling was both practical and symbolic. On the one hand, it helped to dry out corpses and reduce smell. On the other, it gave people the illusion that something sanitary was being done, that death was being contained. In reality, the lime didn't stop plague from spreading, but it did keep the pits from becoming too unbearable to approach. For grave diggers working knee-deep in the trenches, shoveling dirt while breathing in the sour reek of death, every handful of lime was a small mercy. Working conditions were horrendous. Summer heat made pits into ovens, the stench doubling as a punishment you couldn't escape. In winter, frozen ground slowed the digging, meaning bodies piled up in churches, barns, or simply in the open until soil could be broken. Rats and dogs circled constantly, making grave diggers feel more like security guards than labourers as they tried to keep scavengers out. And through it all, they faced the very real fear that they'd be the next ones hauled away. Exposure to plague victims was practically a death sentence, and yet someone still had to wield the shovel. The social atmosphere around plague pits was one of desperation. Families pleaded for proper burials, sometimes bribing diggers with a few coins or a loaf of bread to place their loved one nearer the top of the pile, so they wouldn't be completely lost among strangers. Others begged for a single prayer or candle. Grave diggers couldn't fulfill every request, but they must have seen enough grief to last 10 lifetimes. It was, quite literally, the dirty work of keeping a community functioning in its darkest hours. And yet the work carried a twisted form of job security. When plague swept through, there was never any shortage of work. Some diggers probably earned more in a few months of death duty than in years of regular burials. The irony was cruel. The busier you were, the more likely you were to die yourself. Wages couldn't buy immunity, and plague bearers often followed their cargo into the ground. Still, they carried on. Trenches were dug, lime was scattered, bodies were covered. Medieval life had no pause button, and grave diggers were the ones who kept death moving along, ensuring at least the pretense of dignity for the fallen. Without them, towns would have drowned in corpses and panic even faster than they already did. With them, plague pits became a brutal, necessary compromise. Not holy ground, not proper farewell, but at least an end to the piles of dead filling the streets. For all the horror of plague pits and hurried burials, one thing made the job tempting to the desperate: peril pay. Town councils and parishes knew exactly how risky it was to spend your days hauling plague victims, and if they wanted anyone to pick up a shovel, they had to sweeten the deal. Grave diggers and plague bearers were often paid more than the average labourer, sometimes double or triple the going rate. It was danger money in the rawest sense. Earn a fortune if you lived long enough to spend it. Of course, fortune is relative. We're not talking about sacks of gold or castles on a hill. Payments often came in the form of higher daily wages, extra food allowances, or the occasional exemption from taxes or guild dues. In some towns, workers were given clothing or shoes because nothing wears out boots faster than trudging through mud, lime and corpses. Still, for men who might otherwise be unemployed or destitute, it was a powerful incentive. Starve slowly or get paid to risk dropping dead tomorrow. It wasn't much of a choice, but in medieval economics it passed for opportunity. The money didn't erase the danger. Exposure was constant. Every shift meant direct contact with infected bodies, contaminated clothing, and the foul fluids of the newly dead. There were no gloves, no masks, no antiseptic sprays, just bare hands, woolen tunics, and the faint hope that a good wash in the river would do the trick. Grave diggers didn't just fear the plague, they practically wore it. The irony of being paid extra to shovel bodies into pits only to end up in the same pit yourself, was never far from their minds. And if disease didn't get you, the sheer exhaustion might. Crisis times meant endless shifts, sometimes digging through the night by torchlight, sometimes collapsing on the edge of a half-filled trench. Wages might double, but the work more than doubled too. It wasn't a job for the faint-hearted or the weak-backed, which meant the pool of candidates was slim to begin with. Often, the only men desperate enough to sign up were those with no families left, or those already living on society's margins. The social side of the job added insult to injury. Even as grave diggers earned more, they weren't exactly welcomed into polite company. People avoided them in taverns, steered clear of them in church, and muttered about contagion if one sat too close. High pay didn't wash off the stigma of handling corpses. Imagine finishing a 10-hour shift of trench digging, heading into town with a heavier purse than usual, and finding that no one wants to share a pint with you because you smell faintly of lime and death. It was a lonely wealth, the kind that bought bread but not companionship. At the same time, there was grudging respect. People understood that without plague workers, bodies would pile up in the streets. Some towns even offered burial men special protections, extra rations, legal immunities, or guaranteed burial plots when their time came, which was often sooner rather than later. It was society's way of saying, we don't want to stand near you, but we'll throw you a few perks because you're keeping us alive. It's hard to think of a more medieval compromise. The psychological toll was immense. Handling the dead day after day, especially in plague years, left scars that no hazard bonus could heal. Imagine burying half your neighbourhood in a week, watching families vanish, and then realising you're the only one left alive from your own street. The money in your pouch must have felt strangely heavy under those circumstances. Many plague workers likely drank heavily or numbed themselves however they could, because the alternative was staring the horror of their own job in the face. So peril pay was both a carrot and a curse. It drew men into one of the most dangerous jobs of the Middle Ages, kept towns functional in their darkest hours, and offered wages that could make a pauper briefly comfortable. But it also came with isolation, constant exposure, and the nagging certainty that all that extra silver might end up clinking in someone else's pocket after you landed in the very pit you dug. High risk, short reward. That was the real contract of a plague bearer. If plague pits were the grim end of humanity, swineherds were the squealing reminder that life went on, messily, noisily, and with an appetite for garbage. In a medieval world, without sanitation trucks or tidy compost bins, pigs were the living waste management system. They turned scraps, spoiled grain, and whatever refuse they could snout up into meat. A walking stomach on 4 legs was more than just a farm animal. It was an early recycling plant, and the swineherd was the poor soul in charge of keeping the system running. Swineherds often looked more like wandering beggars than professional farmers. Their job was to round up pigs at dawn, drive them into fields, woods, or the town outskirts, and keep them from eating the wrong thing, or the wrong person. Pigs were famous for their ability to eat nearly anything, and medieval records are full of stories about pigs making meals of corpses, abandoned infants, or drunks who passed out in ditches. A swineherd's daily routine, then, was part shepherd, part garbage collector, part emergency responder. Imagine chasing half a dozen squealing hogs out of a marketplace while trying to convince angry bakers that your charges hadn't actually eaten all the bread rolls. Pigs' taste for refuse made them incredibly valuable. Households tossed scraps, bones, and spoiled food into the streets, where pigs happily gobbled them up. Slops from taverns, peelings from kitchens, and even the odd rat or two ended up as pig fodder. By the time winter rolled around, all that refuse had been transformed into pork, which was one of the few meats poor families could count on. Salted and smoked, it was the backbone of many diets. Without swineherds guiding their voracious herds, towns would have been buried in food waste and short on bacon, a medieval double disaster. But pigs weren't easy company. Unlike docile sheep or plodding oxen, hogs were strong, loud, and stubborn. A swineherd needed a good stick, a loud voice, and endless patience. Town councils often complained about pigs rooting up gardens, knocking over market stalls, or simply blocking traffic by lying down in the middle of the road. Some towns passed ordinances requiring herds to be kept outside the walls, but enforcement was patchy. Swineherds were forever caught between town authorities yelling about pigs wrecking property and villagers yelling about pigs being too far away when they wanted scraps cleaned up. The smell didn't help. Keeping a dozen hogs fed on refuse meant spending your days surrounded by the scent of half-rotten scraps mixed with pig musk. Swineherds carried the perfume of their profession wherever they went, which probably explained why they weren't invited to sit in the front pew on Sundays. Children might laugh at the squeals and antics of pigs, but adults tended to see swineherds as part of the background noise of medieval life, necessary but not exactly prestigious. Still, pigs gave as good as they got. A charging boar could break bones, and even a sow could leave bruises if she didn't appreciate your stick waving. Swineherds had to be wary of tusks, bites and trampling hooves, not to mention the ever-present possibility that their pigs would wander off into the forest and vanish. Losing a herd didn't just mean angry villagers, it could mean ruin. Herds represented food, fat and winter survival. A careless swineherd could be fined, whipped or worse, depending on how many hogs went missing. Despite the danger, the work kept the medieval economy turning. Pigs cleaned up refuse, reduced the risk of disease from rotting scraps, and provided a steady supply of meat. Swineherds might not have had the respect of dyers or butchers, but they played a crucial role in keeping towns livable. Without them, filth would have piled up faster than grave diggers could shovel, and the winter pantry would have been tragically bare. So, while plague bearers shoveled the dead, swineherds kept the living in pork chops. They trudged behind their squealing herds, stick in hand, boots caked with mud and slop, enduring insults from townsfolk and bruises from their own pigs. It was a noisy, smelly and often thankless job, but in the grand mess of medieval life, it worked. Garbage went in, bacon came out, and the swineherd was the slightly bedraggled middleman who made it all happen. Swineherds were walking behind the Middle Ages garbage disposal units. They were also walking straight into a quagmire of village politics. For every farmer who loved the idea of pigs tidying up refuse, there was another who hated seeing his cabbages uprooted or his grain trampled. Medieval towns were full of bylaws about roaming hogs, and swineherds spent as much time arguing with neighbours and councils as they did prodding pigs with sticks. One of the most common complaints was crop damage. Pigs weren't delicate grazers, they rooted. A snuffling hog could turn a neat patch of vegetables into a battlefield in minutes. Fields of barley or wheat were irresistible once the pigs caught the scent, and orchards stood no chance if the herd wandered through. When that happened, angry farmers marched straight to the man in charge, the swineherd. He could expect to face a barrage of curses, demands for compensation, and sometimes even legal fines. In some towns, the bylaws spelled out exactly how much a pig's damage to a neighbour's field was worth, down to the last sheaf of trampled grain. Towns tried to solve the problem with ordinances. Some required herds to be kept on common pastures only, far from gardens and fields. Others banned pigs from wandering inside the market square, though enforcement was shaky at best. A determined hog could outrun most officials, and the sight of a constable chasing a squealing pig through the streets was probably a form of entertainment all on its own. For swineherds, these rules meant constant vigilance and plenty of shouting matches when the pigs inevitably ignored boundaries. Disputes could turn ugly. Records survive of lawsuits over roaming swine, with neighbours dragging each other to court over whether Farmer A's pigs had destroyed Farmer B's beans. Sometimes whole villages were drawn into debates over whether pigs should be allowed to feed in woods or whether that land was reserved for grazing sheep. Swineherds were caught in the middle, blamed for not controlling their animals even when they had no real way of stopping them. After all, no medieval stick was long enough to counteract a pig's determination to find food. The church even got involved. Stray pigs were notorious for causing trouble in churchyards, where they rooted up graves or chewed on funeral wreaths. To stop this, some parishes passed strict bans on letting hogs near consecrated ground. Others fined swineherds who let pigs stray into holy spaces, as if the poor herdsman was personally leading a porcine invasion against the altar. In truth, Pigs were just pigs, hungry, curious, and impossible to fully contain, but the fallout always landed on the man holding the stick. Then there was the ever-present issue of accidents. Pigs roaming freely in town could easily knock down children or elderly passers-by. Medieval records tell of injuries and even deaths caused by hogs, which only added to the pressure on swineherds to keep control. Imagine being hauled before a magistrate because one of your animals bowled over a baker's wife in the middle of the street. Even if the hog just wanted her basket of scraps, the blame landed squarely on you. For all the rules, pigs kept roaming, crops kept getting trampled, and swineherds kept catching the flack. Villagers cursed them for letting hogs loose but relied on them to clear waste. Officials fined them for damages, but turned a blind eye when the streets got too messy and pigs were the only solution. The job wasn't just about walking behind a herd. It was about navigating the endless grumbles, complaints, and bylaws of a community that both needed and resented the animals. So swineherds lived in a world where one moment they were praised for keeping the streets tidy, and the next they were hauled before the council for a cabbage massacre. It was a job that guaranteed steady work, steady insults, and steady fines. In the grand political theatre of medieval villages, the swineherd played the reluctant role of scapegoat, while his pigs cheerfully carried on being pigs. If the politics of roaming pigs weren't enough to make a swineherd's life miserable, the very animals themselves made sure the job stayed dangerous. Pigs were not dainty creatures politely nibbling at scraps. They were strong, aggressive, and occasionally downright terrifying. Every swineherd knew the risk of a sudden bite, a trampling charge, or a tusk that left more than a bruise. Add to that the muck, the parasites, and the general soup of filth that came with pig pens, and you had an occupation that was less pastoral idyll and more daily wrestling match with a garbage-fueled monster. Bites were a real hazard. Pigs have strong jaws, and when they clamped down, it wasn't a playful nibble. Swineherds lost fingers, toes, and occasionally larger chunks if they weren't quick enough with the stick. Children who strayed too close sometimes learned the hard way that pigs weren't pets, and stories circulated of herds turning on drunks or sick villagers who collapsed nearby. Swineherds bore the brunt of this danger, standing between their animals and anyone unlucky enough to look edible. And when feeding time rolled around, keeping a dozen squealing hogs from lunging at the bucket required nerves of steel and quick reflexes. Parasites and disease added another layer of misery. Living cheek by jowl with pigs meant exposure to worms, fleas, and lice that happily jumped from animal to human. The muck in pig pens was a breeding ground for sickness. Slurry filled with manure, scraps, and stagnant water was a paradise for microbes long before anyone knew the word. Swineherds often carried infections, fevers, and stomach complaints, all part of the unglamorous package deal of wading through waste every day. If you managed to avoid bites, you still risked coming down with something unpleasant that no medieval physician could cure. And then there was the muck itself. Pens quickly became choking pits of filth, especially in winter, when animals were penned tighter and drainage was poor. Swineherds slogged through ankle-deep mud mixed liberally with manure, losing boots to the suction and dignity to the smell. Falling in was the nightmare scenario, not just because of the humiliation, but because of what you'd end up covered in. Yet it happened, and when it did, there was nothing to do but get up, scrape off what you could, and carry on. Soap was scarce and expensive, so the smell lingered. Swineherds often stank as badly as their charges, another reason villagers kept them at arm's length. The danger didn't stop at physical filth. Pigs could be vectors for diseases that leapt to humans. While medieval people didn't understand germs, they definitely noticed patterns. Whole communities would fall sick after outbreaks in herds, and suspicion often fell on swineherds for failing to keep the animals in check. Being blamed for spreading illness while working knee-deep in muck wasn't exactly a recipe for popularity. It cemented their low status. Useful when bacon was on the table, despised when sickness came knocking. Yet swineherds endured. Someone had to keep pigs from wrecking markets, someone had to turn scraps into pork, and someone had to take the risk of standing between villagers and hungry hogs. It was dangerous, dirty and degrading, but it kept food flowing and streets marginally cleaner. Their lives were short on glory and long on muck, but in a world where survival trumped comfort, swineherds filled a vital niche. Without them, pigs would have run riot, filth would have piled higher, and pork pies would have been far rarer. So the next time you imagine medieval life as all banquets and merry songs, spare a thought for the swineherd ankle-deep in muck, waving a stick at a tusked boar, hoping not to lose a finger and trying to convince the villagers that, yes, the pigs were worth the trouble. Disease, danger and dung were his daily companions. But so was bacon, and in the end, that was enough to keep the swineherd trudging back to his herd every morning. Gutterers and ditch dredgers slogged through the muck made by everyone else. Their job was keeping medieval towns and fields from drowning in their own filth by clearing street channels, culverts and mill races. In an age before tidy storm drains and civil engineers, flood control came down to a handful of men with shovels, hooks, and a willingness to wade knee-deep into sludge that would have made a pig reconsider its life choices. Towns were full of open gutters that doubled as both drainage and trash bins. People poured slops, chamber pot contents, and every manner of waste straight into the channels lining the streets. When it rained, all of it flushed away, at least in theory. In practice, gutters clogged constantly with straw, dung, and bits of refuse that stuck together like medieval concrete. When the water couldn't flow, it backed up, flooding homes and markets with liquid nobody wanted to identify too closely. Gutterers were the ones sent in with long hooks and shovels to clear blockages before the whole street turned into an open sewer pond. Out in the fields, ditch and dike dredgers had their own headaches. Farmland relied on networks of drainage channels to keep crops from rotting, especially in low-lying regions. Left unchecked, ditches silted up, weeds choked them, and water turned fields into swamps. Dredgers slogged along the banks, scooping muck, hauling weeds, and battling mosquitoes the size of sparrows. It was filthy, wet work, and nobody cheered when it was done, except maybe the farmers who didn't have to row boats through their barley fields. Mill races were another nightmare. Watermills powered grinding stones, fulling hammers and saws, but only if water flowed steadily. A clogged race meant a silent mill, and a silent mill meant angry bakers, clothiers and carpenters. So dredgers were dispatched to wade into icy channels, pulling out branches, stones and whatever else the current had dragged in. In winter, the water numbed legs to the bone. In summer, the stink of rotting vegetation and the threat of leeches added their own charm. There was no glamorous way to dredge a mill race. It was wet, cold and thankless every time. The hazards were as constant as the muck. Floodwater carried disease, and dredgers worked bare-legged or barefoot, standing in soup that mixed animal waste, human waste, and everything in between. Cuts and scrapes quickly turned septic. Rats scurried along the banks, eyeing the workers as if they were intruders in the rodent's kingdom. And if the current picked up, a man could easily be knocked off balance, dragged downstream, and deposited unceremoniously in a deeper pool. Drowning in a ditch wasn't dignified, but it happened. And yet, towns depended on these flood fighters. Without them, streets would overflow every time the skies opened, markets would reek even worse than usual, and harvests would rot in sodden fields. They were the unseen maintenance crew of the Middle Ages, battling nature and human waste with nothing but muscle power. People might mutter that they stank, but they were quick to complain when a gutter overflowed outside their door. Like gong farmers and knackers, gutterers and dredgers occupied that special medieval category, despised when present, missed when absent. The pay wasn't glamorous either. Sometimes they were hired directly by towns, sometimes pressed into service by manorial lords as part of feudal obligations. Either way, it wasn't enough silver to make wading through a cess-filled gutter feel worth it. Still, in a world where options were slim, a job that kept the water flowing was better than no job at all. So gutterers trudged the streets with hooks and buckets, while dredgers worked the ditches and dikes beyond the walls. They splashed, cursed and dug ankle-deep in slime, the unsung defenders of medieval drainage. Floods were relentless, muck was endless, but as long as they kept shoveling, towns could function and fields could grow. It was dirty work and nobody wanted it, but in the grand hierarchy of medieval filth, somebody had to keep the water moving. The real horror for gutterers and dredgers came from what they actually found once they got their shovels into the muck. Medieval gutters and ditches weren't politely filled with rainwater and a few leaves. They were grab bags of human nastiness and agricultural leftovers. Every clean-out was a lottery of filth, and the prizes were never pleasant. The most common discovery was layers of manure mats. Horses, oxen, donkeys, and every other beast of burden left deposits on the roads daily, and all of it washed into the gutters with the next rain. Over time, it compacted into thick, spongy layers that were part dung, part straw, and part mystery. Shoveling through it was like carving into a damp mattress that smelled like a stable fire. The stuff clung to tools and boots, refusing to let go, and one slip meant a face-first introduction. It's no wonder gutterers walked with a wary, wide-legged shuffle. It wasn't clumsiness, it was survival. Then there was rotten thatch. Roofs shed constantly, and discarded bundles often ended up tossed into ditches. Once waterlogged, they turned into slimy, decomposing mats that clogged channels tighter than any beaver dam. Wrenching them out took both strength and gag reflex control, as the smell of wet straw mixed with stagnant water created something close to a chemical weapon. Worse still, sometimes the thatch hid nastier surprises underneath, like drowned rats or the odd snake that had made the ditch its final resting place. Dead animals were the true jackpot of disgust. Dogs, cats, goats, and even the occasional pig carcass washed into culverts or ended up dumped into ditches when owners didn't want to deal with disposal. Pulling out a half-decayed goat by its legs while trying not to vomit was a rite of passage for any ditch dredger. And because nothing in the Middle Ages went to waste, the carcass wasn't always left behind. It might be carted off to the knackers or stripped of anything remotely useful, even in its sorry state. Imagine showing up to work thinking you'd shovel silt and ending the day wrestling a bloated sheep out of a gutter. Other treasures included broken pots, kitchen slops, and enough bones to make you wonder whether the tavern cook had decided the ditch was an easy rubbish bin. Market refuse, vegetable peelings, rotten apples, discarded fish heads, also found its way in. On hot days, the stench was apocalyptic, an invisible wall that hit you before you even saw the water. Dredgers joked, or maybe just complained loudly, that they were less workers and more divers into the collective stomachache of the entire town. And let's not forget the human element. Chamber pots were emptied straight into street channels, so what started as a drainage gutter doubled as an open-air sewer, shoveling through layers of manure mats only to hit that was unmistakably human waste. Wasn't unusual, it was expected. Every worker knew that once you put your shovel in, you stopped asking questions. The less you thought about what you were handling, the easier it was to sleep at night. The unpredictability was what made the job uniquely miserable. You never knew whether you'd be shifting mud or prying loose a dead dog tangled in straw. Sometimes you got lucky and it was just silt. More often, it was a mix of everything foul, congealed into something that defied description. And all of it had to be hauled out, piled on the bank and carted away before the water could flow freely again. So when townspeople complained that gutters stank or ditches overflowed, they rarely spared a thought for the poor souls actually digging through the mess. For gutterers and dredgers, the filth was more than an inconvenience. It was an occupational hazard. Every shovel load was a gamble, and the only sure bet was that whatever came up would be revolting. It was a dirty job, yes, but in the grand medieval tradition, somebody had to do it, because otherwise the entire village would be swimming in its own leftovers. As if dredging up half-rotten goats and mats of manure wasn't already a strong enough deterrent, the job came with its own set of everyday hazards that made the work both miserable and genuinely dangerous. Medieval gutterers and ditch dredgers weren't just shoveling muck, they were running a gauntlet of leeches, collapsing trenches, and invisible threats that nobody fully understood, but everyone feared. Leeches were a constant companion in stagnant ditches. Wading in bare-legged meant offering your calves as a buffet. You could climb out of a channel after an hour's work, only to find half a dozen little black hitchhikers sucking away happily. Picking them off was unpleasant enough, but the bites bled stubbornly, leaving you spotted like a butcher's apron. Some townsfolk liked to claim leeches were healthy because physicians used them to bleed patients. For dredgers, that was cold comfort. It's hard to feel the medical benefits while standing in mud, swatting at vermin and watching your own blood drip into the ditch. Then there was the risk of trench collapses. Clearing a clogged dike or repairing the sides of a channel often meant digging into wet, unstable soil. Walls gave way without warning, burying shovels, buckets, and sometimes the unfortunate man holding them. A collapse could break bones or drown a worker in waist-deep sludge. Safety rails, pumps, and reinforced walls were centuries away. The only protection was instinct. If the ground shifted or the water surged, you scrambled out fast and hoped you didn't lose a boot, or worse, a leg. The air itself posed dangers. People didn't know about bacteria, but they did believe in bad air, or miasma, and in this case they weren't far wrong. Stirring up clogged gutters released clouds of stench strong enough to make men swoon. Workers coughed, choked, and sometimes vomited as they laboured, blaming the foul vapours for fevers and headaches that followed. In truth, they were probably inhaling mould spores, parasites, and every germ the town had flushed into the channel. The mould, in particular, thrived on rotting thatch and damp timber tossed into ditches. It coated surfaces in slimy mats that clung to hands and tools, leaving skin itchy and raw. Rats added their own hazards. Where waste and water collected, rodents thrived, darting between ankles and leaping for scraps of offal. They carried fleas and diseases, though nobody could prove the connection at the time. All a dredger knew was that working in a ditch meant being watched by beady eyes while risking a bite if you disturbed a rat nest. Add in snakes in warmer regions or frogs and toads leaping out at unfortunate moments, and the whole experience was less idyllic countryside stream and more wildlife ambush in a sewer. Infections were a grim occupational hazard. Cuts and scrapes were inevitable when hauling broken pots, sharp bones, or splintered timber out of the muck. Once a wound met the slurry of manure, waste, and stagnant water, it was practically guaranteed to fester. Red streaks, swelling, and fevers followed, and many dredgers probably carried permanent scars from seemingly minor injuries. In a world without antibiotics, a nasty gash from a broken jar hidden in the mud could end up being a death sentence. Despite all this, the work never stopped. Floods didn't wait for safer conditions, and towns couldn't afford to let their gutters choke up. So men trudged back into the ditches day after day, shrugging off leech bites, coughing through clouds of stink, and hoping the walls stayed upright. They joked, cursed, and spat in the mud, treating the hazards as part of the job, because, in truth, they were. If you signed on as a dredger, you knew you'd come home with bites, bruises, and a smell that lingered long after you washed. For the rest of the town, it was easy to forget these hazards existed. People only noticed gutterers when the water overflowed, and only appreciated their work when disaster was narrowly avoided. The risks, the bloodsuckers, the fevers, those were invisible. What mattered was that the streets stayed passable and the crops didn't drown. For the men with the shovels, though, the hazards were a daily reality, as much a part of the trade as mud under their fingernails. If ditch dredgers were cursed to shovel other people's waste out of water, midden keepers and street muckers had the honour of handling the dry version. They were the masters of heaps, the guardians of communal refuse piles, the unsung organisers of ash, bones, and whatever else households tossed away. Every medieval town had its middens, pits or mounds where waste collected, and somebody had to keep them from spilling into the streets or catching fire. That somebody was usually a poor wretch, paid in pennies and insults, armed with a rake, a shovel, and an iron stomach. A midden wasn't just a rubbish heap. It was a snapshot of community life in its foulest form. Into it went everything. Ashes from hearths, bones from kitchens, broken pottery, dead hens, spoiled grain, fish guts, and the occasional chamber pot dumped by a lazy neighbour. The pile grew steadily, a stinking pyramid of medieval leftovers. Left unchecked, it would spread across alleys and invite every dog, pig and rat in the district to come feast. The midden keeper's job was to heap it neatly, rake it down, and sometimes cart away the older layers before the whole thing turned into a mountain. Think of it as medieval waste management without the uniforms, the gloves, or the health insurance. Street muckers had the equally lovely task of clearing what didn't make it to the heap. Horses clattered through town, dropping their contributions on the cobblestones. Dogs fought over scraps, and market stalls left behind spoiled vegetables and fish heads. Unless somebody cleaned it up, all that muck mixed with rain to turn the streets into ankle-deep sludge. Muckers trudged up and down with rakes, shovels and wheelbarrows, scraping the streets clear. It wasn't glamorous, but without them, every street would have resembled a barnyard floor after a storm. The heaps themselves were more complicated than they looked. Some were managed communally, with townspeople expected to dump waste in designated spots. Others were semi-commercial operations. Midden keepers sold older layers of ash and decomposed waste to farmers as fertiliser. Bones could be sold to glue makers, ash to soap makers, and even scraps of cloth or leather found buyers somewhere. One man's trash was another man's side hustle, and the midden keeper was the middleman, quite literally in the middle of the stink. Of course, managing a midden wasn't just a matter of stacking garbage. Fires were a real hazard. Ash dumped while still hot could smoulder unnoticed until the whole heap began smoking like a witch's bonfire. A midden fire wasn't just a nuisance, it could spread to nearby houses if sparks caught thatch roofs. Midden keepers had to stomp out blazes with shovels, probably cursing whichever neighbour thought dumping half-lit coals was acceptable. On top of that, there was always the risk of collapse. Piles shifted, bones and pottery rolled underfoot, and more than one keeper probably ended up buried to the waist in a cascade of rotting fish heads. The smell was, predictably, unforgettable. While tanners and knackers had their own signature stenches, middens carried a democratic bouquet, a little bit of everything, all festering together. You could smell a heap before you saw it, and the poor midden keeper smelled like it long after he went home. Street muckers fared no better, returning from shifts covered in muck spatters that no amount of scrubbing could disguise. Soap was scarce, perfume scarcer, so the aroma of their trade followed them everywhere. And yet, like all the other foul trades, the work mattered. Without muckers, streets would have been impassable in wet weather. Without midden keepers, towns would have drowned under their own refuse. Farmers needed fertiliser, soap makers needed ash, and glue makers needed bones, all supplied by the humble heap. People laughed at midden keepers, but they depended on them more than they admitted. So while nobles dined in great halls and merchants boasted of profits, midden keepers and muckers were in the alleys, raking refuse and carting muck, making sure the town didn't choke on itself. They were the unseen backbone of public hygiene, doing work nobody wanted but everybody needed. Heap masters, indeed, lords not of land or castles, but of the piles and streets that kept medieval life just barely livable. Street muckers didn't just stand around tending piles, they were constantly on the move, scraping, scooping, and carting waste from one place to another. Every day, markets, stables and taverns produced fresh loads of manure, vegetable scraps, and all manner of organic chaos. Left in place, it would rot where it landed. Collected and carted off, it could be transformed into something marginally more useful, fertiliser. The daily sweep was less about cleaning for beauty and more about making sure the town's mess ended up in the fields rather than underfoot. Markets were the worst offenders. After a day of trading fish, poultry and produce, the cobblestones were littered with spoiled cabbages, broken eggs, fish heads and feathers clinging to puddles of blood. Muckers moved in after the stalls closed, scraping it all into carts. The sweep was part janitorial duty, part salvage operation. Some scraps might be fed to pigs, others burned, and the rest dumped on the midden. If you've ever seen a modern cleaning crew descend on a stadium after a big event, imagine that, but with more manure and fewer hot dog wrappers. Stables added another dimension. Horses, oxen and donkeys were the engines of medieval life, but they were also walking manure factories. A busy stable could produce mountains of dung in a single week. Muckers hauled it out by the cartload, shoveling straw and manure into piles that were then trundled to nearby fields. Farmers actually welcomed these deliveries, since animal waste enriched the soil. In a way, muckers were the unsung link between urban filth and rural fertility, the original recycling service, albeit one that smelled like it should have been outlawed. Transporting the waste was its own ordeal. Carts heaped with manure had to be pushed or dragged through narrow, uneven streets. Wheels jammed in ruts, loads spilled, and sometimes the muck slopped over onto unfortunate passers-by. Imagine walking home from market with your bread loaf only to get splattered by a passing dung cart. The only consolation was that sooner or later everyone had the same experience, which meant nobody could claim superiority in the face of flying manure. The job wasn't just physically exhausting, it was risky. Streets were crowded with animals and people, and a runaway cart full of muck could bowl someone over. Add slippery cobblestones and foul weather, and you had a recipe for falls, injuries, and spectacular public humiliation. Yet the work had to be done. Without the daily sweep, markets would drown in waste, stables would stink worse than they already did, and fields would go without fertiliser. Muckers often timed their rounds for late evening or early morning, when traffic was lighter. This gave towns the illusion of cleanliness during the day. Visitors might stroll through a market and think how lively and orderly, without realising that just hours earlier, muckers were knee-deep in cabbage rot and horse dung. Like stagehands in a grim theatre, they kept the show running smoothly, unseen but essential. For all their efforts, muckers weren't exactly celebrated. They were paid little, mocked often, and treated as part of the background. Still, the service they provided was undeniable. Fields needed manure, towns needed clear streets, and nobody else was volunteering to shovel dung. In their own way, muckers were part of the lifeblood of the medieval economy. Every loaf of bread, every mug of ale, every roast chicken depended on grain grown in fertilised fields, and that fertiliser arrived courtesy of muckers hauling manure from town to countryside. So while nobles feasted and merchants tallied profits, the muckers were on their endless sweep, scraping markets clean, carting dung from stables and dumping it in fields. They trudged through the muck, shoulders straining under cart handles, boots caked with filth, providing a service as vital as it was thankless. The medieval world was a cycle, and muckers were the ones keeping it turning, one load of manure at a time. You couldn't spend a day raking waste, hauling dung, and managing refuse heaps without coming home perfumed like a barn on fire. The stench was unavoidable, inescapable, and unforgettable, a sort of occupational cologne that seeped into hair, clothes, and skin. Even if a mucker did manage to bathe, which wasn't exactly common in the Middle Ages, the smell clung stubbornly, as though the muck itself wanted to remind everyone of its importance. This was the true smell tax of the job, constant odour that no wage could offset. And it wasn't just smell, it was the vermin that came with it. Middens and muck carts were playgrounds for rats, mice, flies, and every crawling thing that thrived on rot. Muckers didn't just shovel waste. They fought daily battles against clouds of flies buzzing around their heads and rats darting between their boots. A dropped loaf of bread in the street could vanish in seconds, not because someone ate it, but because the vermin beat everyone else to it. Children grew up thinking it normal to see rats scampering along midden piles, but muckers knew just how bad the infestations could get. They were on the front line, swatting, cursing, and occasionally throwing shovelfuls of filth at the boldest offenders. The towns naturally tried to impose order. It wasn't enough for muckers to clean, they also had to follow rules about how to clean. Spill a cart of dung in the wrong place and suddenly you weren't just a man covered in muck, you were a man fined for making more of it. Councils issued ordinances about where waste could be dumped, how middens had to be managed, and which streets had to be kept clear. These laws were written on tidy rolls of parchment by men who had clearly never wrestled with a wheelbarrow full of horse manure on cobblestones. A sudden spill might be unavoidable. A wheel broke, a dog darted underfoot, a child got in the way, but to officials it was negligence. A mucker might end his day not only smelling like the midden but also lighter in the purse. Neighbours weren't shy about complaining either. If the stench drifted a little too far, or if vermin became too bold, households marched to the town hall to grumble about it, as if the muckers wanted to reek, or as if they could somehow persuade rats to stay politely inside the pile. The irony was that the very people filing complaints were often the same ones who dumped their waste in the first place, tipping chamber pots into the gutter at dawn and then sniffing disdainfully when the street stank by noon. Still, without the muckers, things would have been far worse. The smell tax they paid daily was what kept towns marginally livable. Their endless hauling meant that at least some of the waste ended up in fields instead of festering in alleys. Vermin would have swarmed regardless, but with muckers stirring and moving the heaps, the piles didn't grow high enough to swallow the town whole. The fines may have stung, but they were proof that communities recognised the importance of muck control, even if they were too proud to admit it outright. For the muckers themselves, the smell was a mark of identity. You could always tell who they were in a crowd. People gave them space in markets, not out of respect, but because no one wanted to stand too close. Children teased, tavern keepers sighed, and marriage prospects were understandably slim. Still, in their own way, muckers held a certain pride. If they had to stink, at least they stank in the service of everyone else's comfort. So the smell tax was the hidden cost of keeping streets passable and markets bearable. Muckers endured the reek, the vermin swarms and the occasional scolding from officials, all while trudging behind carts that could spill disaster at any moment. The job paid little and demanded much, but like every other foul trade in the medieval world, it was indispensable. Without muckers and midden keepers, the stink wouldn't have been a tax. It would have been the entire economy. And so we come to the end of our strange little tour through the hidden workforce of medieval life. From gong farmers and fullers to dyers, butchers, knackers, swineherds, dredgers and muckers, we've wandered through alleys, ditches and slaughter yards, following the people whose jobs were vital, but rarely admired. They lived among the smells, stains and swarms that everyone else tried to avoid. And for their efforts, they earned more scorn than thanks. Yet without them, the grand castles and bustling towns we so often romanticise would have collapsed under their own filth. Think of the gong farmer, down in the pits with his long hook, scraping out the very waste that no one dared speak about. Imagine the fuller stomping in tubs of stale urine to make wool soft and bright for wealthy merchants. Remember the dyer, permanently stained blue, guarding his guild secrets while standing over vats that smelled worse than any plague pit. Or the butcher, swinging cleavers in streets slick with blood, keeping families fed, even as neighbours pinched their noses. And of course the knackers, boiling down carcasses in yards so foul they were banished to the far edge of town, turning death itself into candles and glue. We saw the swineherd chasing squealing pigs through muddy lanes, caught between bylaws and crop complaints, swatting away tusks and parasites while everyone grumbled about bacon shortages. We trudged beside the ditch dredger, pulling rotten thatch, drowned dogs and leeches out of clogged channels to keep towns from flooding. We smelled the midden keepers' heaps and the muckers' carts, keeping streets barely passable as vermin swarmed and fines loomed. And we stood with the grave diggers and plague bearers, digging faster than they could think, burying whole neighbourhoods in trenches sprinkled with lime, hoping their pay outlasted their own breath. It wasn't a glamorous world, but it was a necessary one. These were the jobs that made everything else possible. Without them, nobles couldn't feast, merchants couldn't strut, and peasants couldn't boil their humble stews. They were the backbone of survival, the dirty hands that held society together while the rest of the town pretended not to notice. But here, in the quiet of night, we notice. We pause to thank them, not with coins or guild honours, but with memory. For every foul trade was a thread in the fabric of medieval life, woven through with sweat, stink and unacknowledged importance. It's easy to laugh at the strangeness, to wrinkle our noses at the smells, but there's comfort too in knowing that humanity has always found ways to keep life moving, no matter how unglamorous the work. So let the images fade now. The muck heaps, the blue-stained hands, the squealing pigs, the shovels sinking into frozen ground. Let them drift into the shadows of history where they belong, important but distant. Take a breath, feel the softness of your blankets, and remind yourself that your evening doesn't involve lime pits or dung carts. Tonight, your only job is to rest. Close your eyes. Let the world of medieval filth dissolve into dreams. And may your sleep be cleaner, quieter, and far cosier than any swineherd, mucker, or gong farmer ever knew. Good night.